Hi, this is Paul. A couple of you talked a little bit about the Jordan Peterson conversation about Islam. I watched about a quarter of it, didn't find a lot in it that interested me. So if there's anything further in, send me a link with a timestamp or something that has something that you thought was of interest. What really struck me about the video was the degree to which this individual, there are a couple of things. What was his name? Philosopher Muhammad Hijab. Well, it almost sounds like a. If you don't know many words about Islam, those are two of them. But a couple of things struck me about the conversation. First was how much of it sounded like sort of atheist Christian debates on YouTube from 10 years ago, sort of stuck in all of those issues. The second thing that struck me was all of his citations and quotations of the Quran were done in Arabic. Now, that is to be expected because if you're a faithful Muslim, the Quran really can't be translated. And we can look at Northrop Frye's comment right at the beginning of his lectures at the University of Toronto that Christianity read the Bible in translation. Now, there's a really fun channel, Useful Charts, that is done by someone who, to one degree or another, is a professing Jew. And he's made some very interesting videos, pretty much from a modernist academic perspective. And his video, Who Wrote the Quran, was really quite interesting. That's sort of driven me back into a bunch of questions about the history of Eastern religion. And by that, I don't mean Eastern Orthodoxy. The Church of the East, sometimes known as the Nestorians, had a tremendously impressive evangelistic mission to the East all the way to China. This is from a book that sometimes the Kindle cover looks really like some third grader made it up on his Commodore 64, for you Commodore 64 fans out there, and I know one of them. The Lost History of Christianity by Philip Jenkins. I've made a few runs at this book over the years. The book has some issues, but the topic is incredibly interesting and I think pertinent to the questions that we have about Islam. Islam is one of those major world religions. Of course, Tom Holland has In the Shadow of the Sword that I would like to get through again. This morning, in fact, I listened to a really terrific Tom Holland lecture that you can find on YouTube with over 1 million views called The Origins of Islam, where within less than an hour, Tom Holland walks through his perspective on the engagement of the historical question with respect to the founding story of Islam. And a lot of that seems very much wrapped up in the history of the period, the Persians versus the Roman Empire, the fall of the Roman Empire in the East. But this is sort of where Jenkins' book takes over the long and interesting history of the Church of the East, which was a major church that was very early. There's another lecture. This lecture by Philip Jenkins on the Seaver College Distinguished Lecture Series from Pepperdine University that he gave in 2009, or at least was posted in 2009, has gotten not yet 7,000 views, but tells some interesting tidbits about this story. So I picked up a couple of other books. There's not a lot. Part of the thesis of Philip Jenkins is that the churches who are the remnants both of the Eastern Empire, and that would be Orthodoxy, and the Western Empire, that would be the Roman Catholics and then the Protestants, know very little of the history of the Asian church. The Asian church, at least according to Jenkins, was incredibly well developed, advanced. Anselman will probably remind us of some of the theological differences between them and the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. Anselman is a pretty good Wikipedia of a lot of theological material, but this was quite a significant church. What's interesting is if you sort of think about this in combination with Tom Holland's thesis, what arises are some really interesting questions about basically what Islam is. C.S. Lewis, in the letter that he sent to the letters that are in A Severe Mercy, Sheldon Van Auken. We'll let the fire truck go by. Maps out a few interesting short ideas about Islam's relationship with Christianity. He basically sees Islam as a simplification of Christianity in some respects, just as Buddhism is a simplification of the religion that rises out of India in some respects. And so part of Tom Holland's thesis is that this isn't exactly his thesis. This is probably his thesis from like some parts of mine. If you look at the relationship between the Latter-day Saints Church, the Mormons, and religion in the burned over district that gave rise to the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses and a variety of other groups, Holland basically asserts that the areas out of which Islam grew were in some ways similar to that, in that these were sort of a lot of fringe ideas that were sort of pushed out of the empire into the fringe areas. And out of that grew this religion, which in some ways is a rather blurry appropriation of a lot of the material that would have been pushed to the fringes. And for Tom Holland, he arises at his ideas in a combination of reading the text of the Quran closely, as well as looking at the civilizations and the history in the area. One of the things that arises out of this is, as in this, again, this really interesting video on useful charts talks about, in some ways, Christ is analogous to the Jewish scriptures and to the Islamic text. The Bible is our witness to Christ, but the text, again, I'll just leave the link to the video, or you can find it, just Who Wrote the Quran, Useful Charts. It'll come up right away. It's a very interesting video, and it's got my mind turning on these topics for a variety of reasons. One of something that I was considering doing some talking about is David French's The Deconstructing White Evangelical Politics, an article that got a lot of play last week. And it's the continuing anxious thoughts of sort of the conservative evangelical never Trumpers that were in many ways traumatized by the embrace of many evangelical churches to Trumpism and then to a bunch of the stuff that followed. I'm not terribly interested in weighing into that fight. I see it as a little bit of a distraction from what I'm more interested in, which I think is a level below in terms of a level of analysis. I thought a more interesting article that my friend Bill Harris from CRC Voices pointed out to me on Twitter was from Ryan Burge, who I also follow on Twitter, who is someone who does a bunch of demographic work on trying to make sense of the religious movement of the masses today. And this article from March 2, 2021, what's up with born-again Muslims? And what does that tell us about American religion? Can you be a Muslim and identify as a born-again or evangelical? Pastors and theologians who are reading this are engaging in a lot of head shaking right now, but hear me out. Does a Muslim check the box next to born again or evangelical actually tell us anything about how they view themselves in the social, political, and religious space? I think the answer to that question is yes, and I don't believe it's an issue of measurement error or poor survey design. Instead, it means to tell us something deeply profound about what terms like evangelical mean to a Muslim or really to any non-Protestant identifier over the last decade. And I wouldn't even, obviously the shock comes from the non-Protestants, but I would assert that in terms of the low resolution purview through which Americans appropriate a political identity, this makes a lot of sense. The CCES has been asking respondents a series of questions about their religious belongings and behaviors back to 2006. They ask a question about respondents' present religion and Muslims is the sixth option offered. But they also ask, would you describe yourself as born again or evangelical Christian or not? The two responses are yes and no. Let's start tracking how the share of Muslims who identify as born again or evangelical over the last 13 years. To get a sense of scale, the total sample of this series is nearly 500,000 respondents, and the small sample years were 15,000, and the largest was 64,000. And he goes into some of the math there. I've seen a lot of weird things from that sample, and that's let's assume 2006 is an outlier. So there's a lot of weird things in that sample. If that's excluded, the share of Muslims who are evangelical averaged 8 to 10% from 2008 through 2014. With a margin of error, there's not much difference across that time period. However, something shifted in 2015, and you all know what happened in 2015. Who came down the escalator and into America's political life. And the percentage of evangelical Muslims jumped into the mid to low 20s for the next 3 years. It dropped again to 12% in 2018, only to rise to nearly 20% in 2019. Of course, 2015 and 2019 were the years running up to the election, which very much put a bunch of these religious political issues up into the forefront. It's fair to say that there's no discernible pattern here, at least not one I can easily pinpoint. That huge jump between 2014 and 2015 may be related to the emergence of Donald Trump, but that would be a stretch. And it still doesn't fully explain the dip in 2018, which also could be an outlier. Let's try to explore one potential reason that a Muslim would choose to identify as born again or evangelical. They just don't have a good grasp on the question. So the people who are putting this down, it's basically garbage data. The best proxy to get to the root of that is educational level. Put simply, are more educated Muslims less likely to identify as evangelical? It appears that those Muslims with less education are more likely to identify as evangelical. For instance, 57% of all evangelical Muslims have a high school diploma or less, while only 38% of Muslims who don't identify as evangelical. And at the top end, 19% of Muslims who are evangelical have a 4-year college degree, compared to 26% of non-evangelical Muslims. So maybe this has something to do with understanding the question being asked. But maybe this is about something else that is unrelated to the awareness of the implication of the question. It's possible that the term evangelical has become a proxy for I am religious and very devout in my faith. That to me sounds like a dog who will hunt. It's a way to signal to the world that I am just a Muslim because of culture or heredity, but I'm born again because I deeply care about my faith. If so, we would expect Muslims who attend services at a mosque more frequently to identify as evangelical at higher rates. And the data do seem to support this. 57% of Muslims who identify as evangelical say that they are at the mosque at least once a week. For non-evangelical Muslims, it's much lower at just 31%. And yearly mosque attendance is twice as prevalent as non-evangelical Muslims than those who identify as born-again or evangelical. So there does appear to be multiple factors driving this identity. It is both an issue of question awareness, but also religious devotion. But there's still another possibility that always looms in these discussions: politics. As I've written about before, evangelicalism in the United States has not declined because most people are adopting the label for seemingly political reasons. The evidence of that is that the share of political conservative, self-identified evangelicals who rarely attend church has risen nearly 50% in a decade. Now again, this is interesting, and there was a lot of talk in 2015 about who's all excited for Trump instead of Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz, who are the people that were expected to be the 2016 Republican candidates that were supposed to energize the Christian base. There's a lot of talk in 2015 that it was these people who identify as Christians but don't go to church. In other words, the meaning of the word evangelical, as it has been used in mass media, has basically twisted it so that a degree of Muslims around the United States can now use it to identify themselves. That's interesting. So maybe a Muslim taking on the evangelical monitor is really doing so for reasons that are enmeshed in politics. To test that, I ran a regression model with some basic controls for gender, income, and education. The thing I am trying to predict is the likelihood of a Muslim embracing the evangelical label. A quick glance gets us to an unmistakable conclusion. Being a Republican makes a Muslim much more likely to identify as an evangelical. Amongst those attending yearly or less, this gap is fairly modest, at 5 to 10 percentage points. However, the gap begins to widen as attendance increases. Among those who attend services multiple times a week, about 30% of Democrats and independents identify as evangelical. It's over half of Republican Muslims who attend that frequently. There are two takeaways from here. First is that the evangelicalism has become a shorthand for very devout. That is evidenced by the fact that a Muslim attendance increases. I thought I might be interrupted. It wasn't an interruption for you, but it was for me. I talked to a homeless guy earlier today, and he didn't know if he wanted to go to the hospital and didn't want to lose his stuff. And I know he had a storage locker. So I said, go put your stuff in the storage locker and come back and I'll give you a ride to the hospital. But when you send these guys out like that, more than half the time, something happens between the initiation of the plan and the mission and whether it actually achieves its fulfillment. And so I was kind of waiting around. Am I going to do a video? Am I going to do anything? I don't know, because I'm not going to live stream, because chances are good once I start this, he'll knock on the door and say, okay, Pastor Paul, I need to go to the hospital. Which is exactly what happened. So I'm bumping up against my evening hours now, but I want to just finish this and get this out. So I'm not even exactly sure where I landed, but I left everything on the computer here. There are two takeaways for me here. First is that evangelicalism has become a shorthand for very devout. That evidenced by the fact that as mosque attendance increases, so does an evangelical identity regardless of partisanship. Isn't that interesting? However, clearly evangelicalism has melded with republicanism in the United States for non-Christian religious groups. That's interesting. I'm left with this really interesting conclusion. The perception among non-Protestants is that evangelicalism is a badge of religious devotion for Americans of faith. They identify with it even though it's not theologically congruent with many of their traditions. But for a lot of Protestants, it's become a more social and political designation and less a religious one. For Muslim Republicans, this is a way to identify more completely with their partisan inclinations while deprioritizing the fact that Islam doesn't have a born-again component to its faith tradition. Or, in fact, if they find themselves being in some ways reinvigorated as in their Islamic identity, do they take that language on in English? Now, of course, the language comes from the Gospel of John, born again, born from above, John chapter 3. But this is fascinating. It's easy to chalk things like born again Muslim to bad survey design or measurement, but if you peek under the hood just a bit, you begin to see that the survey respondents are telling us something potentially profound by answering these questions in seemingly odd ways. So yes, there are evangelical Muslims, and it's a meaningful signal. You see, when people come to America and they bring their religion, or when their religion is brought to America and it's only a generation or two old, things change. And part of the thesis behind Tom Holland's work is that what emerges in time is this story. And there are evidence in the Quran of different layers to the story, as Christians have been looking at in the Bible for a long time. And that all of this is a very live situation. Religion always has been. So, I just wanted to bring that article up and let you know kind of what I'm thinking about. I will post this for 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. Question and answer will be at 10 in the channel. If there's not enough questions, I haven't looked at the Discord to see how many questions there are going to be. Maybe we'll do an hour of question and answer and maybe an hour of talking in the little chat room, but there's a lot more people who show up. So I don't know what we'll do tomorrow. Rick can't be at church to run it like he was before. And there's no question and answer for the 24th and the 31st. So this will be the last question and answer of December. So we'll see what happens. Anyway, just thought I'd do this little short.